He ruled an empire built on fear. She swept its floors in silence. No one saw it coming, not even them. For 8 years, Cassian Moretti carried a dead man's weight across his shoulders and called it power. He built the Blackthorn Syndicate into something people whispered about in locked rooms. He gave orders that ended careers, erased debts, and occasionally erased people. He did not sleep well. He did not sleep much at all. And on the worst nights, the ones where the sound of gunfire lived inside his skull like a permanent resident, he sat alone in the dark of Moretti Estate and drank until the silence stopped screaming at him. Then a maid dropped a vase at his feet, and nothing was ever the same. If you've ever wondered whether a man like that can be reached, whether someone buried that deep inside their own damage can actually find their way back, stay with this story until the end. Drop a like right now if you're already feeling it, and leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Let's begin. The rain came in sideways the night Cassian Moretti returned to Aldenvale. It had been 2 years since he'd set foot on the estate grounds. 2 years of operating from temporary headquarters in Geneva and Budapest, and a brief, brutal 3 months in Sao Paulo that he didn't discuss with anyone. 2 years of conducting the Blackthorn Syndicate's international affairs from hotel suites and borrowed boardrooms, all because the sight of those iron gates made something behind his sternum clench up like a fist. He came back because he had to. His mother had made that clear in the kind of quiet, precise language she used when she wasn't making a request. Come home, Cassian. There are things that need your presence, not a phone call. You. So here he was. The car rolled through the gates at 11:47 on a Tuesday, and the estate materialized out of the dark and the rain like something from a fever dream. The long gravel drive lined with oak trees that had been old when his grandfather was a child. The stone facade of the main house lit from below. The east wing where his father's study still sat untouched behind a locked door that nobody had opened in 8 years. His driver, Marco, said nothing. Marco had been with him for 6 years and understood the architecture of Cassian's silences. He pulled the car around to the main entrance, cut the engine, and sat still. I'll call you, Cassian said. Yes, sir. He got out alone. The rain soaked through his jacket before he reached the front steps, which was fine. He didn't care about the jacket. It was the kind of thing his advisors cared about. The appearance of him, the packaging, the immaculate surface that the criminal world read as invulnerability. Tonight, standing in the rain on the steps of the house where he'd grown up, he was just a man getting wet. Greta, the estate's longtime head housekeeper, opened the door before he reached it. She was a compact, gray-haired woman, somewhere in her 60s, with a face that had settled permanently into an expression of mild disapproval. She'd run the household since before Cassian was born, and made no secret of the fact that she considered him a disruptive presence in her carefully managed domain. Mr. Moretti. She stepped back to admit him. Your mother is waiting in the sitting room. I'll have someone take your bags up. I can manage the bags. That is what staff is for, Mr. Moretti. He looked at her. She looked back. He gave up, which was the only reasonable response to Greta, and walked past her toward the sitting room. The estate smelled the way it always had. Old stone and beeswax polish, and something faint underneath both, something that belonged specifically to this house and nowhere else. Walking into it was like stepping through a wall of memory. He felt it in his jaw first, a tightening, and then in his hands, and he made himself keep moving. His mother was exactly where Greta had said she'd be, sitting in the high-backed chair nearest the fireplace with a cup of tea going cold on the table beside her, and a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. Isabella Moretti was 61 years old and looked 50, not because of anything artificial, but because she had the kind of bone structure that simply refused to surrender and the kind of posture that communicated authority without effort. She'd been the wife of a syndicate head, then the widow of one, and somewhere in the gap between those two identities she had become something harder to categorize, an advisor, a diplomat, a woman whom dangerous men treated with genuine, unperformed respect. She looked up when he walked in. You're wet, she said. It's raining. Evidently. She set the book down and studied him the way she always did, openly, without apology, taking inventory. You look terrible. Thank you for having me. Sit down. He sat, not in the armchair she'd gestured toward, but on the edge of the fireplace hearth, which put the fire at his back and let him face the room. Old habit. She noticed, because she noticed everything, but said nothing about it. The Reinhold matter, she said. You handled it. Last month. And the situation in Sao Paulo? Contained. I heard contained meant something more specific in this case. It did. Isabella picked up her tea, looked at it, put it back down. The council is restless. 3 of them have requested formal meetings with you within the next 2 weeks. Dorian Fell is positioning himself again. He's been very careful about it. Nothing overt, but he's been talking to the Eastern families. Cashin's jaw tightened again. Dorian Fell was 64 years old and had spent 20 of those years believing the Blackthorn Syndicate should answer to a committee rather than a single head. He was patient and he was cautious, and he was, Cashin had no doubt, eventually going to become a serious problem. I'll meet with the council, Cassian said. All of them together, not separately. That's a choice that communicates something specific. I know what it communicates. His mother looked at him for a long moment. The fire cracked behind him. Outside, the rain was picking up. How are you sleeping? She asked. Fine. Cashin. Not well. It doesn't matter. It matters to me. I know it does. He looked at the fire rather than at her. I'm managing. She didn't push further, which meant she'd decided to let it go for now, which also meant she hadn't decided to let it go. His mother had perfected the art of patience as a weapon. She would return to this. She always did. They talked for another hour. Logistics, finances, 2 ongoing negotiations with business partners in Zurich, the status of a contested territory in the southern district that had been quietly bleeding for months. By the time Cassian climbed the stairs to his rooms, it was past 1 in the morning, and the house had settled into the deep silence that large old buildings produced when the last of their people had finally gone still. He didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the window of his bedroom and watched the rain move across the grounds and tried not to think about anything specific. Thinking specifically was dangerous. Thinking specifically led to the night 8 years ago, which led to the car, which led to his father's hand releasing its grip on his, which led to the particular quality of stillness that a person acquired when they stopped being a person and became just a body. He watched the rain until it stopped. Then he watched the dark. At 5:15, he gave up and got dressed. The estate came alive at 6. He'd forgotten about that. 2 years away had softened the memory of it. The early morning activity that ran through the household like a current, the kitchen staff arriving first, then the housekeepers and groundskeepers, and the various people who kept a property this size functioning. They moved through the back corridors and service areas in a parallel world that the Moretti family occupied without fully inhabiting, and for the most part, they were as invisible to him as furniture. I was crossing from the east corridor toward the main library at 6:43, carrying a half-empty cup of coffee, and moving at a pace that communicated, "Leave me alone," in the universal language of people with authority, when it happened. She came around the corner at speed. He registered the shape of her. Small, slight, arms full of something. But he was reading a file and he didn't adjust his course, and neither did she. And then there was a collision that was genuinely violent in the way that collisions between a moving body and a stationary one tend to be. She hit his chest. He stumbled back a step. The file went sideways. And the crystal vase she'd been carrying, a heavy, faceted thing that had belonged to his grandmother and probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, went straight down and exploded on the stone floor. The sound was enormous in the quiet hallway. Cassian looked down at the destruction. Then he looked at the woman who'd caused it. She was young, mid-20s, maybe, in a housemaid's uniform with her dark hair pulled back under a white cap that had gone crooked in the collision. She was already on her knees, reaching for the larger fragments of crystal with her bare hands, and he watched, with a detached kind of horror, as a piece of the vase edge caught the meat of her palm and opened a clean red line across it. She made a small, involuntary sound and pulled her hand back. Blood welled up immediately, bright against her skin. Something happened inside Cassian's chest that he couldn't immediately categorize. Not anger exactly. He'd been building toward anger a moment before, the vase, the noise, the papers scattered across the floor, but the sight of her bleeding hand broke the trajectory of it and left him with something that felt uncomfortably close to alarm. "Don't," he said. "Stop picking it up." She looked up at him. Her eyes were light-colored, gray or maybe green, he couldn't tell in the corridor light. And her expression was an interesting combination of genuine fear and something that wasn't quite defiance but was adjacent to it. She was afraid of him. They all were. But she hadn't looked away. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised him. I wasn't watching where I was going. I'm very sorry, Mr. Moretti. The vase? I'll pay for it, whatever it costs. I'll stop talking. He crouched down to her level, which seemed to confuse her deeply. Your hand. She looked at her palm. The cut was still bleeding. It's fine. It's not fine. You're bleeding on my grandmother's floor. She looked at the floor, then back at him, and something shifted in her expression. A flicker of something that, under any other circumstances, might have been the precursor to a laugh. It vanished immediately. I'm sorry about that, too. He stood up. Go to the kitchen. Have someone look at that cut. He paused. What's your name? She blinked. It was clear that being asked her name by Cassian Moretti was not an experience she'd been prepared for. Elara, she said. Elara Bennett. He nodded once. Then he picked up his scattered file, stepped around the wreckage of the vase, and walked away. He thought about her twice that day, which was 2 times more than he'd expected to. The first time was in the middle of a phone call with his legal counsel, a 45-minute exercise in controlled frustration concerning a property dispute in the Northern District. He was standing at the window of his study looking out at the grounds, saying nothing while his counsel talked, and he found himself thinking about the way she hadn't looked away. Most people looked away, staff especially. They'd stare at the floor, the ceiling, their own shoes, anywhere but at him directly. It was a reflexive thing, the same way smaller animals kept still when larger ones moved nearby. She had looked straight at him. The second time was at dinner, which he ate alone in the dining room, while his mother attended a meeting with 2 of the estate's account managers. The housekeeper Greta came in at the end to clear the plates, and he asked without particularly planning to, the maid who dropped the vase this morning, Elara Bennett, what do you know about her? Greta's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. She's been with us approximately 8 months, Mr. Moretti. Came to us through the Domestic Employment Service. She is competent when she applies herself. The incident this morning was careless. Was it? She came around a blind corner. Regardless, staff are expected to be aware of their surroundings at all times. How's her hand? A brief pause. I beg your pardon? She cut her hand on the vase fragments. I told her to have it looked at. Did someone look at it? Greta's expression had moved from tight to carefully neutral, which was a different thing. I'll inquire. Do that. After he left, he sat alone at the long table and finished his wine and thought about why he'd asked. He didn't come to any useful conclusions. 3 days passed. He met with the syndicate council, all of them together, as he'd told his mother, in the large conference room on the 2nd floor, and it went the way these things always went. Dorian Fell was perfectly pleasant and said almost nothing of substance. The Eastern representatives were cautious but cooperative, and 2 of the younger lieutenants competed aggressively for Cassian's approval in ways that were embarrassing to witness. He ran the meeting for 2 hours and left them with the distinct impression that things were proceeding exactly as he intended, which was the only impression he ever left anyone with. What they didn't see was that by the time he walked out of the conference room, his hands were shaking, not visibly. He'd gotten very good over the years at making sure nothing was visible, but they were shaking, a fine internal tremor that started somewhere near his solar plexus and radiated outward whenever he spent too long in rooms full of people who wanted things from him, who were watching him for weakness, who would pivot toward Dorian Fell with their loyalty overnight if they sensed for even a moment that he was something other than what his reputation described. Han modded to the private garden on the west side of the estate before the panic arrived fully. It came the way it always did. A sudden, total conviction that the air had become insufficient, that his heart was operating incorrectly, that something catastrophic and irreversible was in the process of happening inside his body. He knew by now that this was a lie his nervous system told him. Knowing it was a lie did not make it feel like a lie. He sat down on the low stone bench near the rose trellises and focused on the ground between his feet and breathed with deliberate mechanics, in for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 6, and waited for his own body to stop betraying him. He became aware gradually that he wasn't alone. Someone was working at the far end of the garden, kneeling in the soil near the base of the south trellis, pulling weeds with their hands, not looking at him. The domestic staff sometimes used the west garden for groundskeeping tasks. He hadn't thought about that. He watched the figure for a moment and then recognized her. Elara Bennett had changed out of her housemaid's uniform into work clothes, dark trousers, and an old gray sweater, and she was pulling weeds with the focused, slightly aggressive efficiency of someone who found physical labor satisfying. Her right hand had a strip of white medical tape across the palm. She hadn't seen him, or if she had, she was doing an exceptional job of pretending otherwise. He should go back inside. He had calls to make and papers to review and a follow-up conversation with his mother that he'd been putting off for 2 days. Instead, he said, "Bennett." She went very still for a moment. Then she sat back on her heels and turned to look at him. The late afternoon light caught her face directly, and he saw clearly for the first time that her eyes were gray. A specific, unusual shade, light and direct. "Mr. Moretti." No panic in her voice. Just the same steadiness as before, with maybe an additional layer of wariness underneath it. "Your hand." She looked at the tape on her palm. "It's fine, just needed a few days." "Sit down," he said, and then immediately heard how that sounded and added, "If you're taking a break, I'm not ordering you." She studied him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully interpret. Then she stood up, brushed the soil off her knees, and came to sit on the other end of the bench. Not close. She left a deliberate gap between them. They sat in silence for a while. The garden made small sounds around them. Birds moving in the hedges, wind across the top of the stone wall, the distant murmur of the estate's sprinkler system in the east grounds. "You weren't watching where you were going either," she said. He looked at her. "That morning," she said. "You were reading. You weren't watching where you were going either." A pause. "I'm not saying it wasn't my fault. I'm just saying it was both of us." He had not expected that. "You're telling me I was also responsible for the vase. I'm telling you it was a shared event." She met his eyes steadily. "I'll still pay for it if you wanted me to. But I'm not going to pretend I walked into a wall." Something in his chest shifted, a small, unexpected movement. Not anger. Almost the opposite of anger. "How long would it take you to pay for that vase on a housemaid's salary?" She thought about it. 18 months? Maybe 20. "Forget it." "Mr. Moretti," I said forget it. The vase wasn't a favorite. It had been, actually. "Consider it settled." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once and turned back toward the garden. He watched her profile, the line of her jaw, the way she held herself without either rigidity or collapse. Just a kind of quiet equilibrium that he found, with some confusion, enormously calming. "How long have you been working here?" he asked. 8 months. "Where before that?" "A hotel. Housekeeping, same work. Before that, a private residence in the city. I've been in domestic service since I was 19. "How old are you now?" 24. He did the math. 5 years in service, starting young, which meant something specific about her circumstances at 19, but he didn't ask what. "Do you like it?" She seemed genuinely surprised by the question. "The work?" "The work." She was quiet for a moment. "I like having a task and completing it. I like being good at something." She paused. "I don't like being treated like I'm part of the furniture." "Who treats you like that?" She looked at him, and the look was eloquent enough that he didn't need an answer. "Right," he said. "It's not specific to here," she said. "It's just how domestic work is. You're meant to be present, but not noticeable. Useful, but not human." She said it without bitterness, which somehow made it worse. "I've gotten used to it." He said nothing. He was looking at the garden, but what he was seeing was a room 8 years ago. His father's face in the moment before the shooting started. The way the older man had looked at him with an expression that was neither fear nor acceptance, but something else entirely. Something Cassian had never been able to name. He was seeing that, and simultaneously he was sitting in this garden in the late afternoon light, and both things were equally real and equally present, and the pressure behind his eyes was building the way it always built when he let himself get too close to it. He breathed. 4 in, 4 held, 6 out. "What's wrong?" Ilara said. He looked at her sharply. "Sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't have. It's not my place." "Then why did you ask?" "Because you look like someone carrying something very heavy and pretending it doesn't exist." She said it simply, without performance. "People do that. I've seen it a lot. You learn to recognize it." He stared at her. She didn't look away, but she also didn't push. She just waited, in the same patient, steady way she'd been working the garden, neither pressing forward nor retreating. "I don't discuss personal matters with staff," he said. "I know." She stood up. "I should get back to work. I'm sorry for overstepping." She turned and walked back toward the trellis, picking up her gardening tools with the same quiet efficiency, and he watched her and felt with great clarity that he had just refused something that was being offered, and that the refusal had cost him something he couldn't quantify. Alara! She stopped, didn't turn around immediately. Then she looked over her shoulder. Thank you, he said, for noticing. A pause. Then she nodded. Good night, Mr. Moretti. She went back to work. He sat in the garden for another 20 minutes, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember, the pressure behind his eyes began to ease. He apologized to her formally 2 days later. He found her in the east corridor carrying a stack of fresh linens, and he stopped her directly. Not in passing. He made her stop, which meant he planted himself in her path in a way that left no ambiguity about intent, and he said, I owe you an apology for the morning of the vase. She looked at him. You already told me to forget the cost. That's not what I'm apologizing for. He held her gaze. I was rude to you. I raised my voice. It wasn't warranted. A beat. You were startled. I was angry because I'd spilled my file and I took it out on you. That was wrong. He heard how strange this was, Cassian Moretti apologizing to a housemaid in a corridor. And he didn't care. I'm apologizing. She was looking at him with the most unreadable expression. Then she said, Apology accepted, Mr. Moretti. Cassian. Another pause. I don't think that would be appropriate. I'm not asking you to say it to anyone else. He held her eyes. If we talk again, like we did in the garden, Cassian is fine. She took a breath. All right. A pause. Cassian. It was the first time anyone had said his name without the weight of either deference or strategy attached to it. Just a name. Just the word. He went back to his study and tried to work and failed completely. They talked again 3 days later. He found her in the garden. He told himself he wasn't looking for her, that he simply preferred the west garden in the evenings, and both of these things were partially true, and they sat on the same bench and talked for nearly an hour. Not about anything serious, not at first. She told him about a stray cat that had been living in the east groundskeeper's shed for 2 months, which the groundskeeper was officially ignoring and unofficially feeding. He told her, without quite intending to, about a dog he'd had at 11 years old that had followed him everywhere on the estate grounds, and that his father had pretended to find annoying while consistently feeding it table scraps when he thought no one was watching. He stopped when he realized he'd said his father. What was his name? Ilara asked. The dog. Soldier. Of course it was. The faintest smile. He sounds like a good dog. He was. He was quiet for a moment. My father named him. She didn't say anything to that. She just let it exist in the air between them, and that was exactly the right thing to do. Not filling it, not rushing to cover it with something more comfortable. He looked at the garden, and she looked at the garden, and the name of the dog, and the name of the man who'd given it, settled slowly into the silence like sediment. He died, Cassian said, 8 years ago. I know, she said. I mean, I'd heard. Estate staff hears things. What have you heard? That it happened suddenly. That it was violent. She chose the word carefully. That you were there. He said nothing. I'm sorry, she said. That you went through that. He turned to look at her. People say that. I know, but I mean it. How do you know you mean it differently than they do? She thought about it. Because when I say I'm sorry, I'm not sorry for what it means for the business, or for the syndicate, or for whatever it means politically. I'm just sorry that a person you loved died in front of you and you had to carry that. She met his eyes. That's the thing I'm sorry about. He had been in boardrooms with men who charged $400 an hour to analyze emotional dynamics, and not one of them had said it that clearly. He looked away. His jaw was tight. I wasn't good after, he said. For a long time, I'm still... He stopped. I manage. You said that before. It's accurate. It means you're holding it together from the outside and it's still a mess inside, she said. Holding together is not the same as being okay. He turned to look at her sharply, but there was nothing presumptuous in her expression. No performance of insight, no bid for intimacy. She was just saying what she saw, the way she'd told him it was both of them with the vase. Direct, without agenda. It's been 8 years, he said. People expect whatever is convenient for them, she said. Grief doesn't care about expectations. I was quiet for a long time. The evening came in around them, the light going blue-gray. the first stars appearing in the east. "I have panic attacks," he said. He had never said that to anyone. Not to his mother, not to his lieutenants, not to the medical professional his mother had arranged for him twice, and whom he'd seen exactly once before dismissing. Since that night, "They come when I'm in rooms with too many people who want too much from me. They feel like dying." He paused. "They're not. I know they're not. But they feel like it." Elara didn't speak immediately. When she did, her voice was very steady. "What helps?" "Being outside, being alone." He looked at her. "This, apparently." She held his gaze. In the fading light, her gray eyes were very clear. "Then we can talk in the garden," she said simply. "When it gets bad." He nodded. It was one of the smallest gestures he'd ever made, and it cost him almost nothing, and it changed everything. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them. He met with the council and the lieutenants and the business associates and the political allies that the Blackthorn Syndicate required to function, and he did all of it with the same controlled, impenetrable precision that his reputation demanded. He made the hard calls and enforced the necessary boundaries and spent long hours in the operational command room reviewing intelligence and directing resources and doing the work that running a criminal empire actually consisted of, which was significantly more administrative than the outside world imagined. And in the evenings, when the day's work was done, and the pressure behind his eyes had built to the level where he needed to either find somewhere to breathe or start losing his grip on the internal machinery, he went to the West Garden. She wasn't there every evening. She had a schedule, shifts, a life of her own that existed entirely independent of him, and about which he was slowly, carefully learning the details. She'd grown up in Kelmore, a working-class neighborhood in the city's East District. Her mother had worked as a hotel laundress. Her father had driven freight trucks and died of a heart attack when Elara was 16. And after that, there'd been 2 years of watching her mother struggle before Elara had entered domestic service and started sending money home. She'd been doing that for 5 years. She still did it. She had 3 close friends from her previous position. She liked to read, crime novels specifically, which made him laugh the first time she mentioned it, a genuine laugh, the kind that startled him by existing. She had strong opinions about coffee. She hated formal occasions. She'd never been outside the country. He learned all of this piece by piece, in fragments and asides. And each piece was ordinary, and none of it was interesting in isolation, and somehow it accumulated into something he found himself returning to with an attention he couldn't justify. She learned him too, in the same slow way. She learned that he couldn't eat breakfast before 10 but required coffee before 7, or the day started badly. She learned that he got quieter, not louder, when he was actually angry. The raised voice was performance, but the silence was the real thing. She learned that the east wing of the house made him tense in a way he carried in his shoulders, that he would walk the long way around the house to avoid passing the locked study door. She learned that he was ruthlessly competent at almost everything and quietly devastated by his own insomnia, by the way the night stretched out into something that refused to end. She did not tell him what she'd learned. She just adjusted around it, the way competent people do, quietly, without drawing attention to what they're doing. One evening he arrived at the garden in worse shape than usual. He'd spent the afternoon in a meeting that had spiraled into a confrontation with 2 of the Eastern lieutenants over a territorial decision he'd made 3 weeks earlier, and the confrontation had been managed and resolved, and he had won it unambiguously. And none of that mattered because the entire thing had triggered something in his system that was still going 2 hours later, his heart rate elevated, the familiar panic hovering at the edge of things like smoke from a fire he couldn't see. He sat on the bench and she came out of the garden shed with dirt on her hands, and she took one look at him and said, "Tell me what you see, right now. What's in the garden?" He stared at her. "Just look around and tell me what you see," she said, out loud. He had no idea why he did what she asked. Maybe because she said it like it was simple, like it was obvious, with no hesitation and no clinical framing. He looked at the garden. "Roses," he said. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. "The south trellis. It needs work. There are dead canes on the left side." He kept going. "The stone wall. There's moss at the base, near the corner. The bench. The lantern hasn't been lit yet. It'll come on at dusk." He paused. "The hedge at the north edge is uneven. Someone trimmed it recently, but not all the way across." "What do you hear?" "Wind." He listened. "Your tools in the shed, something metal. They're settling." He listened harder. "Birds in the oak on the east side." "What does the air smell like?" He breathed in. Rain coming, and roses. And he paused. The soil where you've been working. He was breathing normally. He looked at his hands. The tremor was gone. Grounding technique, she said simply, sitting down beside him. Someone taught it to me. You focus on what's actually there instead of what's happening in your head. She shrugged. It's not a cure, but it helps. He looked at her, better. Where did you learn it? My mother went through a bad period after my father died. I was 17. I learned some things. She looked at her hands, at the dirt under her fingernails. Grief does similar things to people regardless of why it comes. He thought about what that meant. A 17-year-old learning grounding techniques to help her mother survive grief, carrying that knowledge for 7 years until she sat on a bench next to a man who needed it and offered it without ceremony or fanfare, the same way she offered everything, as though it cost her nothing. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. Just breathe. He stayed in the garden until the lantern came on, but it was Greta who first noticed. He became aware of it not through anything the housekeeper said to him. She wouldn't have dared, but through a shift in the estate's social temperature that he registered the way he registered most things, through the behavior of the people around him. The other housemaids became careful when he was in the corridor. Greta became more careful. One of the junior footmen started looking at the floor with aggressive dedication whenever Cassian walked past. His mother noticed too, though she said nothing. She watched him across the dinner table one evening with an expression he recognized as active calculation, and he met her eyes and she looked back down at her plate, and they both let it go for now. What they were all noticing was this: Cassian Moretti was sleeping. Not well, not fully, not without interruption. But he was sleeping, in ways he hadn't for years. The shadows under his eyes were lightening. The particular quality of controlled tension that had lived in his jaw and shoulders for 8 years was loosening, incrementally, like ice in early spring. Not gone, not even close to gone, but changed, less absolute. I was also, his lieutenants reported with some bewilderment, less unpredictable in meetings. The rages that had occasionally erupted in the operations room, the cold, devastating kind that left people standing very still and breathing carefully, had not appeared in 3 weeks. He was still demanding. He was still immovable when he needed to be. But the irrational edges, the places where exhaustion and grief had made him dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with strategy, were receding. Nobody could explain it. He could have explained it, but he didn't. He was talking to a housemaid in a garden at sunset. She was telling him the truth about what she saw. He was, for the first time in 8 years, being seen by someone who had no stake in what they found. 6 weeks after his return to the estate, on a cold Thursday evening with frost threatening the rose bushes, he told Alara about the night his father died. He'd never told anyone. Not completely. The official account existed in documents and depositions, and the carefully constructed narrative the syndicate had built around the event. His mother knew the shape of it. His lieutenants knew the operational facts. No one knew what it had felt like from the inside. He told her. He told her about the car and the road and the way the headlights of the other vehicle had appeared suddenly with no time to prepare. He told her about the sound of the shooting and the glass and the way his father had pushed him down across the seat, the weight of the man's hand on his back, and then the weight of the man himself. He told her about regaining consciousness in a hospital room and understanding, from the silence of the people in it, exactly what that silence meant. He told her about the guilt that had followed, the survivor's conviction, irrational and inescapable, that he should have died instead. That if the universe had been operating correctly, it would have been him. He was younger. His father had more left to offer. The math, the terrible arithmetic of grief, said clearly that the wrong person had made it out of that car. He told her all of it. She listened through the whole thing without interrupting him once. She sat very still, and she listened, and when he stopped talking and the silence settled over the garden, she stayed in it with him for a long moment before she spoke. "You know that's not how it works," she said. "Who deserves to survive?" "I know. But knowing doesn't help." "No." She looked at the frosted grass. "My father was 51 when he died. Heart attack. There was nothing anyone could have done. He was working a 12-hour shift and he collapsed in the cab of his truck, and he died before the paramedics arrived." She paused. "For 2 years I thought about whether, if I'd come home that summer instead of staying in the city for work, I would have seen something, some sign. Could have made him see a doctor." She paused again. Grief makes you the author of things you didn't write. He looked at her. You didn't write what happened that night, she said. It was written without you. The guilt is real, but the logic behind it isn't. I thought about that for a long time. The frost was advancing across the grass, and the lantern was lit. And in the quiet of the garden, with her words still in the air around him, something deep in his chest made a movement that he couldn't name. A kind of shifting, the way tectonic things move when the pressure finally becomes too much to hold. He wasn't fixed. He didn't feel fixed. But something was different. When he walked back to the house that night, he went through the east corridor, past the locked study door. He didn't stop. But he didn't look away either. He just walked past it. It was the first time he had done that in 8 years. By morning, the frost had killed 2 of the outer rose bushes. Elara was in the garden before 7, assessing the damage, her breath coming in small clouds in the cold air. He stood at his bedroom window and watched her work, and the feeling in his chest had no name in any language he had access to, but he recognized it the way you recognize weather that's been approaching for days. The storm, he understood, had already arrived. He just hadn't looked up yet to see it. The frost that killed the outer rose bushes was still on the ground when Greta came to find him. I was in the study. His study, not his father's, the one on the second floor with the wide desk and the eastern window, going through financial reports from the Zurich accounts, when she knocked twice and entered without waiting for a response, which was the particular brand of insubordination she'd perfected over decades, and which he'd long since stopped challenging because it wasn't worth the energy. Mr. Moretti. She stood just inside the door with her hands folded in front of her, the posture she used when she had something to say that she'd already decided was important. I need to speak with you about a staff matter. He didn't look up from the report. Speak. It concerns Elara Bennett. He looked up. Greta's face was arranged in the expression she used for situations she found distasteful, which covered a wide range of things, and which Cassian had learned to read with reasonable precision. This particular configuration, the slight tightening around the mouth, the eyes a degree cooler than usual, meant she was bringing him information she believed he needed while simultaneously disapproving of the reason it had become necessary. What about her? There is talk among the staff, Greta said, about the frequency of your conversations with her. In the garden. In the evenings. He set down the report. Is there? I want to be clear that I am not making accusations. I am simply informing you that the other staff have noticed, and that where staff notice, people outside the estate will eventually notice as well. She paused. The Blackthorn Syndicate's reputation depends in part on Greta. His voice came out flat. Not loud, just flat. I understand what you're telling me. A beat. Then you understand why I felt it necessary to... I understand, you can go. She held her position for a moment longer than was comfortable, which was itself a kind of statement. Then she nodded once and left. He sat looking at the door after it closed. The irritation was immediate, which he examined without acting on it. Greta wasn't wrong, technically. In the world he operated in, the appearance of things carried weight. A syndicate head who spent his evenings talking to a housemaid in a garden was a story. Stories got shaped by whoever needed them most. He picked up the report. He put it down again. He went to find his mother. Oh, Isabella was in her private sitting room with the estate's head accountant, a thin, precise man named Holbert, who had worked for the Morettis for 30 years and who excused himself with the quiet efficiency of someone long accustomed to family interruptions. Cassian waited until the door closed behind him. Greta came to see me, he said. His mother looked at him over the rim of her reading glasses. Sit down. I'll stand. Then I'll ask you to stop looming. It's unpleasant. She set down her papers. What did Greta tell you? That there's talk about Elara Bennett. There is talk, Isabella said. There has been talk for about 2 weeks. I was waiting to see if you'd mention it yourself. And when I didn't? I assumed you were aware of it and had decided it wasn't your concern. She looked at him carefully. Was I wrong? He said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and his mother read it the way she read everything he tried not to say. Cassian. Her voice shifted. Not softer exactly, but more precise, the way it got when she was being honest rather than diplomatic. You look better than you have in years. You're sleeping. You're present in meetings. Last week Renner told me you laughed at something in the operations room. She paused. He said the entire room went still because no one remembered that sound. He felt something move in his jaw. Renner talks too much. Renner has worked for you for 4 years and has been terrified of you for 3 of them. The fact that you laughed frightened him more than the usual alternative. She took off her reading glasses and set them on the table. I'm not blind, and I'm not going to pretend I don't know what or who has made the difference. What I want to know is what you intend to do about it. Nothing. That's not an answer. That's avoidance. She's a member of your household staff, he said. She's 24 years old. She's the first person in 8 years who has managed to reach you. Isabella's voice was entirely level. I'm not assigning that weight carelessly. He turned away toward the window. Outside, the frost-killed rose bushes were still visible from here. Brown and collapsed at their bases, the healthy ones rising behind them. Alara had been out there at first light assessing them. He hadn't looked away quickly enough, and the fact that he hadn't looking away quickly enough was the whole problem laid out in miniature. She doesn't know what this life actually is, he said. She knows a garden and conversations. She doesn't know the rest of it. No, not yet. Not yet means there's a rest of the conversation I'm already planning. Isn't there? He was quiet. The question isn't whether you have feelings for her, Isabella said. That question answered itself. The question is whether you're going to let fear make the decision. He looked at his mother over his shoulder. Which fear specifically? There are several. The one that tells you that anything you want will be taken from you. She held his gaze. The same one that's been making your decisions since that car. The room was very quiet. He could hear the accountant moving in the outer office, papers shuffling, a chair scraping back. I need to think, he said. Take all the time you need. A pause. But Cassian, don't take so long that you lose the chance to decide at all. He left without answering. He didn't go to the garden that evening. He worked until midnight instead, running through the Northern District territorial reports and 2 outstanding legal matters and a security briefing from his head of operations, a compact, scarred man named Vasek, who had been running Blackthorn's physical security division for 6 years and who delivered bad news with the same tone he used for everything else, which Cassian appreciated. The security briefing was the part that kept him at his desk longest. Someone's been asking questions in the Eastern District, Vasek said. He was standing on the other side of the desk, hands clasped behind his back, looking at a point approximately 18 inches above Cassian's head. Not directly. Through intermediaries, questions about your schedule, your movement since you returned. Fell? Possibly. The chain's got 3 links before it connects to anything identifiable. Could be Fell, could be one of the Eastern families acting independently. Vasek paused. Could be someone outside the syndicate entirely. What kind of questions about my schedule? Evening patterns specifically. Whether you were consistently somewhere on the grounds. Cassian looked at him. Vasek met his eyes. And in the brief exchange, something was communicated that neither of them put into words. The garden. The evenings. The pattern that Greta had noticed and the staff had noticed, and that had apparently reached someone with enough motivation to probe. Increase the perimeter rotation, Cassian said. Specifically the west grounds, evenings. Already ordered it this afternoon. Good. He paused. Has anyone on staff been approached, directly or otherwise? Not that I can confirm. Find out. Working on it. After Vasek left, Cassian sat in his empty study and looked at nothing. The thing he'd been managing with extraordinary effort not to look at directly was now directly in front of him and impossible to route around. Someone was watching his routine. His routine now included Alara. He thought about what that meant. He thought about all the ways the world he operated in had of using the things you cared about. He thought about his father's hand releasing its grip in a car on a dark road 8 years ago, and he thought about the garden, and the frost on the roses, and a woman with gray eyes who had offered him a grounding technique she'd learned watching her mother survive grief. He sat with all of it for a long time. Then he made a decision. Massab. He found her the next morning. She was in the second-floor linen corridor, working through inventory with a clipboard. And when she looked up and saw him coming toward her with that particular quality of purposeful movement she'd learned to read, her expression shifted, not to fear, but to the careful attention she brought to things she sensed were important. Walk with me, he said. She set the clipboard on the shelf and followed him without asking where. He led her down to the garden, the West Garden, their garden. He'd started thinking of it as that, and was now noting the thought and its implications. And when they were through the gate and the estate wall was between them and the house, he turned and faced her. Someone has been making inquiries about my evening movements, he said. My security team is managing it, but it means our conversations in the garden have been noticed by people outside the estate. She was very still. I see. That could create risk. He watched her face. For you specifically, not for me. I operate inside risk constantly. I have protection. I have infrastructure. You don't have those things. The stillness in her face didn't break, but something behind it shifted. She was processing. He could see it. Not panicking, just processing, working through the implications with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. What are you saying? She asked. I'm saying I need to tell you something before you decide whether to keep having this conversation with me. That sounds like a warning. It is a warning. She held his gaze. Go ahead, he told her. Not everything, not the operational specifics, not the names, not the things that would make her a liability if she knew them, but the shape of it. The fact that the Blackthorn Syndicate was not a legal enterprise, that the territory it held was held through violence and the credible threat of more violence, that the enemies it had accumulated over 3 generations were real and active and sophisticated, that the people who watched his movements and looked for pressure points were not hypothetical. He told her that the people he dealt with sometimes used the people around him. He told her that the reason he'd been alone for 8 years wasn't entirely grief. She listened, stood in the morning cold in the garden without moving, listening, and when he finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, You've been alone because you thought being alone would keep everyone safe. It's more complicated than that. Is it? He looked at her. Yes, it's also easier. That's honest. I'm trying to be honest with you, about all of it. She looked at the dead rose bushes at the south end of the garden, the ones the frost had killed. Then she looked back at him. What do you want from me, Cassian? Not what the situation requires. What do you want? The question went through him like a current, direct and clear and impossible to deflect with strategy. I want to keep talking to you, he said. I want... He stopped, started again. I want to not be managing this alone, which I've been doing for 8 years and which is apparently not actually working as well as I thought. That's the understatement I've heard today. Don't. I'm serious. Her voice had an edge in it now, something he hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, but friction, the kind that comes when someone who has been careful for a long time decides to stop being careful. You've been carrying 8 years of grief and trauma, and you've called it managing. You have panic attacks, and you call them a thing you handle. You've been alone so long you think loneliness is a security system. She met his eyes. It's not. It's just loneliness. He stared at her. You're angry. I'm not angry. I'm just... She exhaled. You came here to warn me off, and you wrapped it in honesty, which I appreciate. I do. But underneath it, you're asking me to make the decision so you don't have to. He said nothing. If you want me to leave, tell me to leave. If you want me to stay, then say that. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing her something. He could see it now in the line of her shoulders. Don't make me do the hard part for you. The silence between them was entirely different from their usual silences. This one had weight and direction. It was the silence before something, not after. I don't want you to leave, he said. Her breath came out in a small cloud in the cold air. She looked at the frost on the ground. Then I'm not leaving, she said. They stood in the garden in the cold with the dead rose bushes and the surviving ones, and the estate rose around them on 3 sides, and the weight of everything the next moment would require sat between them like a held breath. And then Greta's voice came from the gate, sharp and carrying. Bennett, you're needed in the east wing, immediately. Alara turned. Greta was at the garden gate, her expression carved from something harder than disapproval now. It was fury, careful and controlled, the kind that had been building for a while and had found its moment. Mrs. Greta, I'll be there in... Now, Bennett. Cassian turned to look at Greta fully. The older woman held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to communicate that she knew precisely what she'd interrupted and that she'd chosen to interrupt it. And then she looked back at Alara with an expression that made the air in the garden feel several degrees colder. The East Wing, Greta said, unless Mr. Moretti would like to explain to his mother why the morning schedule has been abandoned. Alara looked at Cassian. Her face was composed, but her eyes were telling him something specific. This is how it goes. This is what it costs. I know. Go, he said quietly. She went. He stood in the garden and watched Greta escort her through the gate, with the particular satisfaction of someone who believed they had just successfully separated two magnets, and he felt something settle in the pit of his stomach that was cold and clear and not grief and not panic, but something older than both, the specific, steady anger of a man who has just identified an obstacle. I didn't see Alara that evening. He heard why the next morning, when two of the junior maids were talking in the east corridor and went silent when they heard him coming, which was the behavior that meant they'd been discussing something involving him directly. He stopped walking and looked at them, and the younger one, a girl barely out of her teens named Para, who had not yet developed the estate's standard-issue protective blankness, said immediately, "Mrs. Greta changed Bennett's schedule, sir. She's on the early morning rotation now. She finishes by 4. He looked at her. "When did this change?" "Yesterday afternoon, sir." He nodded and walked on, and behind him heard the quick, quiet exchange of two people who'd just done something their instincts told them would have consequences. He found Vasek an hour later. "Greta," he said, "what do you know about her outside relationships, family, friends, whether she talks to anyone outside the estate?" Vasek looked at him for a fraction of a second longer than usual. "I can find out. Do that." He paused. "And I want to know who she's reported to. Inside the estate, outside the estate. Anyone she's had significant contact with in the last 3 months. You think she's connected to the inquiry about your schedule?" "I think she moved very quickly to separate me from someone I've been spending time with, the same week someone outside the estate started asking questions about my evening patterns." He held Vasek's eyes. "I don't believe in coincidence inside my own house." Vasek nodded once. 48 hours. After he left, Cassian stood in the operations room alone for a long moment. The wall display showed the current state of the syndicate's territorial holdings, a map of the city divided into zones, with the Blackthorn sectors marked in blue against the competing interests in gray and red. He looked at it without seeing it. He'd spent 8 years managing the syndicate with the specific surgical focus of a man who had nothing else to protect. No attachments, no personal stakes, no emotional infrastructure that an enemy could reach. He'd thought of it as clarity. He understood now it was also a kind of death. The situation was this. Someone was watching him. Greta had moved against Alara, which meant either Greta was connected to that external inquiry, or she was moving independently, and the timing was coincidence. But Vasek was right that coincidence deserved skepticism. Alara was now on a schedule that kept her away from the evening hours, which had been, for the past 6 weeks, the hours that had done more to stabilize him than 8 years of management and strategy. He could step back. Let the distance Greta had manufactured become permanent. Return to the life he'd been living before the frost and the broken vase and the woman with the gray eyes who hadn't looked away. He was very aware that he was not going to do that. He was equally aware that deciding not to do that meant that everything that came next was a decision he'd made with full knowledge of the costs. The map on the wall blurred slightly at the edges. He breathed. 4 in. Hold 4. Out for 6. 6. Alara had taught him that. He picked up his phone and called his head of household protocol. Not Greta, but the estate's administrative supervisor, a position technically senior to Greta's, and said, in the tone that did not invite discussion, "I'm making a personnel change, effective immediately. Alara Bennett is reassigned. She'll be managing my personal household directly. Draft the paperwork and have it on Greta's desk before noon." A pause on the other end of the line. "Yes, Mr. Moretti." He ended the call. In the East Wing, behind a door he hadn't opened in 8 years, his father's things sat exactly where they'd been left. And in the West Garden, 2 dead rose bushes waited to be cleared, and the surviving ones, the ones that had made it through the frost, were already showing the first tight evidence of new growth along their lower. The paperwork hit Greta's desk at 11:53. Cassian knew the exact time because Vasek had confirmed delivery, and because he'd been watching the clock in a way he hadn't watched a clock since the night his father died. That same acute awareness of minutes, the sense that the space between now and whatever came next was narrowing with each one. He was in the operations room when the response came. It didn't come from Greta directly. It came from his mother's sitting room, via a knock on the operations room door at 12:41, and the person knocking was not a messenger or a junior staff member, but Isabella Moretti herself, which told him everything about the weight she was assigning to the next conversation before she said a single word. She closed the door behind her. "You reassigned her," Isabella said. "Yes." "Without consulting me." "It's my household. It's my estate. She held his gaze without heat, which was more effective than heat would have been. I'm not opposing the decision, Cassian. I'm telling you that you moved faster than the situation required, and fast movements in this house create noise. The noise already existed. Greta made sure of it. His mother was quiet for a moment. What do you mean? Vasek is looking into it. I'll know more in 48 hours. He paused. Someone outside the estate has been making inquiries about my schedule. The same week those inquiries began, Greta rearranged Alara's hours to remove her from the evening routine. He let that sit. I don't think that's coincidence. Something changed in Isabella's expression. A slight sharpening, the way her face moved when she was recalculating. She was quiet for a full 5 seconds, which from Isabella was the equivalent of an extended silence from anyone else. You think Greta is feeding information outside the estate, she said. I think it's possible. I think it needs to be investigated before I decide what to think. She's been with this family for 31 years. I know. Your father trusted her. I know that too. He met his mother's eyes. And I'm telling you, there are two things that happen simultaneously, and the simplest explanation connecting them is one we don't want to be true. That doesn't mean it isn't. Isabella looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the operations room was unlit. It was a working space, not a comfortable one, and the room had the particular chill of a large stone space in early winter. She stood in it with her back straight and her face composed and worked through what he'd told her with the same methodical intelligence she'd been applying to syndicate problems for 30 years. All right, she said, what do you need from me? Don't tell Greta about the investigation. Don't change anything visible in how you treat her. Let her think the reassignment was a whim. He paused. And watch what she does next. His mother nodded once. And Alara? Is in a better position than she was yesterday. That's not what I asked. He looked at the operational map on the wall. I know what you asked. She left without pushing further. Vasek came back in 31 hours, not 48. He appeared at the door of Cassian's study at 7 in the morning, 2 days after the reassignment, with the expression he used when the information he was carrying was the kind that changed things. Cassian took one look at him and closed the file he was reading. Sit down, Cassian said. Vasek sat, which itself was notable. He almost never sat. He placed a thin folder on the desk between them and kept his hand on it for a moment before sliding it across. Greta has a nephew, Vasek said. Formal name is Peter Schall, 41 years old. He runs a small import business in the city's northern district, which is technically legitimate, but the Northern District puts him in contact with Dorian Fell's people regularly. That contact goes back at least 4 years. Cassian looked at the folder without opening it yet. How regular? Monthly, sometimes more. There's a bar in the warehouse district. The Anchor, it's been there 20 years, where Schall meets with a man named Rourke. Rourke is Fell's Eastern liaison. Vasek paused. 3 weeks ago, Schall met with Rourke twice in the same week. The second meeting was the day after you returned from the garden and told Bennett about the external inquiries. The room went very still. She told him, Cassian said. His voice was flat, completely flat. Greta. She told her nephew, and her nephew told Fell. That's the most probable chain, yes. What specifically did she tell him? What does Fell know? Vasek was careful here, based on what Rourke would have been asking for, and based on what Schall could reasonably have passed from what Greta observed. Fell knows that you have a significant personal attachment to a member of the household staff. He knows her name. He knows the pattern of your contact with her. A pause. He knows she matters to you. Cassian opened the folder. The first page was surveillance photographs, grainy, taken from distance, but clear enough. Schall and Rourke at a table in the bar Vasek had named. The second page was a phone record, numbers highlighted, dates and times noted in Vasek's precise handwriting. The third page was something that made Cassian's hand stop moving. It was a report. 3 pages, formatted, the kind that got prepared for someone who needed a brief on an asset. The asset was Alara Bennett. Home address in Kelmore. Mother's name, address, workplace. Friends listed by name. Previous employers, financial situation, accurate, detailed, including the amount she sent home monthly. Medical history, as far as it was publicly accessible. Daily schedule at the estate. It was a targeting package. Cassian set the folder down on the desk with precise, controlled care. He was aware of his own breathing. steady, measured, each breath a deliberate act. The cold thing in his stomach that had settled there 2 days ago was no longer cold. It had become something else, something with heat and edges, and he was managing it the way he managed everything, by not letting it move faster than he could direct it. When was this prepared, he said, based on the paper and formatting, within the last 10 days. Which means Fell has been building this since before I made the reassignment. Yes. He was already moving against her. He was already building the capability to move against her. Whether he's committed to using it depends on what he decides you're worth to him as a threat. Vasek paused. If he believes you're vulnerable through her, he'll use it. Cassian looked at the targeting package, at Alara's mother's name, at the address in Kelmore, where a woman lived alone and sent her daughter to work in a house full of dangerous people without knowing how dangerous. He thought about Alara in the garden, talking about her father dying in a truck cab, about grief making you the author of things you didn't write. He thought about the specific, immovable truth that the worst thing he had ever done was survive his father, and the worst thing that could happen to him now was survivable, and neither of those things was the worst thing that could happen to her. Find Greta, he said. Bring her to the second-floor conference room. Don't tell her why. Well, Greta arrived at the conference room at 8:45 with the bearing of a woman who had decided in transit that she was being summoned for a routine discussion and was prepared to manage it. She came in, saw Cassian standing at the far end of the table and Vasek at the door, and the decision she'd made in transit collapsed. She didn't run. Greta was not the kind of person who ran, but she went still in a specific way, the stillness of a person who has just understood the shape of the room they've walked into. Cassian said nothing. He let the silence do its work. Mr. Moretti, she said. Her voice was steady. He had to give her that. Sit down, Greta. She sat. He remained standing. He placed the folder on the table and slid it toward her. Not the whole folder, just the first 2 pages. The photographs. The phone records. She looked at them. Her face didn't change much. A slight tightening around the eyes. A compression of the mouth that lasted less than a second. Then she looked up at him with an expression that was almost entirely composed and said, That's my nephew. Yes. Where did you... That's not the conversation we're having. He moved around the side of the table, not close, just repositioning, changing the geometry of the room. The conversation we're having is about what you passed to him and why. A pause. I don't know what you think I... Greta! His voice didn't rise. It never rose when it mattered. I've run this organization for 8 years. I know what a compromised source looks like. I know what a loyalty breach looks like. And I have 31 years of history with you, which is the reason we are having this conversation in a conference room and not in a context I couldn't reverse. He let that settle. So let's not do this the hard way. Tell me what you told him. She looked at the folder. Then she looked at her hands on the table. They were very still. The stillness of effort, not calm. I told Peter that you had formed an inappropriate attachment to one of the housemaids, she said. I told him her name and the nature of the relationship as I understood it. And you told him about the evening routine, the garden. Yes. Why? She looked up at him then, and for the first time in 31 years he saw something in Greta's face that he didn't have a name for. Not guilt, or not only guilt. Something older than that. Something that had been sitting behind the disapproval and the precision and the 30 years of careful management for a very long time. Your father asked me to look after you, she said. The air in the room changed. He asked you to... What? After his security situation deteriorated in the last year before he died, he came to me. He was worried about you, about what would happen to you if something happened to him. Her voice was still careful, still composed, but underneath the composition, something was fracturing very slowly. He asked me to watch out for you, to protect you from things that could make you weak. He asked you to report to him about my vulnerabilities. To protect you, yes. And after he died. A pause. I continued. To whom? She was quiet for a moment that stretched. The people your father trusted. Fell. Mr. Fell was one of your father's most trusted advisors. He has been with the syndicate for... I is trying to dismantle everything my father built, Cassian said. The flatness in his voice had become something colder. He has been positioning against me for 3 years. He has been talking to the Eastern families. And you have been feeding him information about my personal life for how long, Greta? Not since I returned. How long? Her composure was coming apart now. Not dramatically, not with visible emotion, but in the small ways that long-maintained facades fail. A slight trembling in the hands she'd kept so still. A quality in her eyes of someone who has just understood the size of the mistake they made and cannot go back and unmake it. Since the first year, she said quietly, he told me he was honoring your father's wishes, that the information would be used to guide you, to protect you from poor decisions. From poor decisions. He looked at her, like forming human connections. She said nothing. He's been using you for 7 years, Cassian said. He gave you a reason that sounded like loyalty to my father, and you believed it because you wanted to believe it, and you fed him everything he asked for, and he built a file on a 24-year-old woman who has nothing to do with any of this. He placed the third page of the folder on the table, the targeting package, face up. Her mother's address is in there, Greta, her friends, her entire life. He is prepared to use her against me, and the only reason he has everything he needs to do that is because you gave it to him. Greta looked at the targeting package. The composure finished collapsing, not into tears. Greta was not a person who produced tears easily, into something hollower than grief. The specific devastation of a person who has spent decades believing they were protecting something and has just understood that they were doing the opposite. I didn't know, she said, about the file. I didn't know he was... I know you didn't know. His voice had changed, still cold, but differently cold. Not angry cold, exhausted cold. That's the only reason this conversation is still happening. She looked up at him. You are going to tell me everything, he said. Every piece of information you passed, every request he made, every contact, all of it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which put them at the same level for the first time in the conversation, and the shift in geometry meant something. And then we're going to figure out how much he knows and what he's planning to do with it. She nodded, once, small. And Greta, he held her eyes. If you leave anything out, I will find out. And the conversation we have after that will not look like this one. She understood. She talked for 2 hours. By the time she finished, Cassian knew the shape of it. Fel had been running Greta as an information source since the first year of Cassian's leadership, feeding her the narrative that the information served the syndicate's stability, that a young and grief-damaged head needed guidance. He'd received regular updates, Cassian's state of mind, his sleep patterns, his relationships, his decision-making under pressure. 7 years of intelligence, assembled into a comprehensive picture of every place Cassian could be reached, and now he had Alara. Not as an abstract vulnerability, as a specific, documented, addressed target. The people Fel worked with were capable of moving against a civilian. Cassian knew this the way he knew all things about the men in his world, empirically, without illusion. He sent Greta away, not dismissed, not yet, under controlled supervision in her quarters, while Vasek's people worked through the implications, and sat alone in the conference room for exactly 4 minutes before he moved. He moved fast. Vasek first. Full security on Alara Bennett, effective immediately. She doesn't go anywhere without coverage. Her mother in Kelmore gets protection too. Quiet, nothing visible, but real. He paused. And I need to know Fel's current location. He's at his city estate. We've had eyes on it since yesterday. Keep them there. He found his mother next and told her everything, compressed into 8 minutes of clear, sequential facts. She listened with her hands in her lap and her face still, and when he finished, she said, Greta. Managed. She believed she was being loyal to your father. I know. It doesn't change what she did. No. A pause. What do you need from me? I need you to host a dinner, he said. Formal. 3 days from now. Invite Fel. His mother looked at him carefully. You want him in this house. I want him in front of me. He held her gaze. I want him to see that I know, and I want to see what he does with it. And Alara? He was quiet for a moment. She needs to know all of it, not a summary, the real thing. She needs to understand what she's in the middle of and make a choice about it with full information. That choice may be to leave. Yes. He looked at his mother. It may be. He went to find Alara. She was in his private household office. Her new assignment, the space Vasek's people had confirmed, was clean. going through the inventory list she'd inherited from the previous management. She looked up when he came in and immediately read something in his face that made her put the papers down. "What happened?" she said. He closed the door. He sat down across from her. No desk between them, just two chairs, the same geometry as the conference room with Greta, but completely different in weight. And he looked at her and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." She looked at him steadily. "All right," he told her. Not everything, not the full operational picture, not the details she didn't need and couldn't use, but the shape of the threat, the targeting package. Her mother's name on a list in a file held by a man who understood exactly what she meant to Cassian and was prepared to use that understanding. He watched her face as he talked. She didn't break. She didn't cry. She went very still, the same way she'd gone still the morning he'd first told her what the syndicate was, and she listened with those gray eyes holding steady on his face and absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, without performance, without collapse, with the terrible quiet competence of someone who had been handling hard things alone for a long time. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "My mother," she said, "is being protected. Vasek's people are moving now." She nodded, looked at her hands, then looked back at him. "You told me so I could leave." "I told you so you could choose." "That's the same thing." "No," he said, "it's not. Leaving is one choice, staying is another. I'm not telling you which one to make." He held her eyes. "But I'm not going to let you make it without knowing what you're choosing between." She looked at him for a long time. The office was quiet around them, the papers on the desk, the winter light coming through the narrow window, the distant sound of the estate settling in the cold. "If I leave," she said slowly, "he still has the file." "Yes." "Leaving doesn't make me safer. It just removes me from any protection you can provide." "Potentially, yes. So the choice isn't really between safe and unsafe." Her voice was very even. "It's between being in danger here with you or being in danger somewhere else alone." He said nothing, because she was right, and there was nothing useful to add to it. She looked out the window. The frost-killed roses were still visible from this angle, brown and collapsed, the living ones rising behind them, the first new growth just beginning to show. "I'm not leaving," she said. Something moved through him that he didn't attempt to name. "Alara, I heard you. I understand the risk. I'm not leaving." She turned back to face him, and her eyes were clear and direct and entirely decided. "But I need you to understand something." She paused. "If you're going to have me here in this position, in the middle of whatever this is, you don't get to protect me by keeping me ignorant. Not anymore. If something changes, you tell me. If there's a decision that involves my life, I'm part of making it." Her voice had the same friction in it that he'd heard in the garden 2 days ago. Not anger, but the specific, unmovable quality of a person establishing the terms under which they were willing to exist. "I am not furniture. I am not staff. I am not an asset to be managed." "I know what you are," he said quietly. "Then act like it." The air between them held that for a moment. Then he said, "All right." She held his gaze. "All right." It was the smallest negotiation he'd ever conducted, and it was the only one that had ever cost him something real. Outside, Vasek's security team was already moving into position around the West Garden, around the estate perimeter, around a house in Kelmore where a woman lived alone. Inside Fell's city estate, a man who had spent 7 years building a picture of Cassian Moretti's vulnerabilities was about to receive an invitation to dinner, and whatever he did with that invitation would tell Cassian everything he needed to know about how close the edge actually was. The new growth on the surviving rose bushes was barely visible from this distance, just the faintest suggestion of green against brown cane, the kind of thing you had to know to look for in order to... The invitation went out the same afternoon. Cassian wrote it himself, which was unusual. Formal correspondence typically moved through the estate's administrative channels, drafted by staff, and signed by him as a matter of efficiency. This one he wrote by hand, 4 sentences on Moretti estate stationery, the kind of letter that communicated through its own existence that the sender understood exactly what they were doing and had decided to do it anyway. Dorian, dinner Thursday, 8 o'clock, come alone, no title, no formality. 4 sentences that read, to anyone fluent in how men like Fell communicated, as a declaration. Vasek delivered it personally. The response came back within 2 hours, also handwritten, also 4 sentences. Cassian. Thursday at 8. I look forward to it. Alone, of course. Cassian read it once and set it face down on the desk. The next 3 days had a specific quality of compressed time, the kind where every hour carried more weight than the one before it, where ordinary things like meals and briefings and the morning security rotation felt like they were happening at a slight remove from reality, the way the world looks through glass when something enormous is about to change on the other side of it. He told Alara on the second day. Fel is coming Thursday, he said. They were in the household office, the door closed, the space that had become their working baseline since the reassignment. I want you to be present for the dinner. She looked at him carefully. You want me visible? I want him to see that you're still here, that whatever he built toward in that file didn't work. He held her eyes. I also want to see how he looks at you. And if he looks at me the way you're afraid he will, then I'll know what I need to know. She was quiet for a moment. What do you need me to do? Be yourself. Don't perform anything. Don't be smaller than you are to make the room more comfortable. He paused. Can you do that? She looked at him with the direct, undecorated quality that had been the first thing he'd noticed about her and said, I've been making myself smaller my entire adult life to keep people comfortable. I think I'm ready to stop. He nodded. Good. Cassian. She waited until he looked at her fully. Whatever happens Thursday, whatever he says, whatever he tries, don't let it make you into someone you don't want to be. He held her gaze. What if that person is the only one who can end this? She didn't look away. Then be him if you have to, but know you're choosing it. Thursday arrived gray and cold, the sky the specific white of early winter, the grounds of the estate locked under a frost that hadn't fully lifted since morning. The dinner was set for 8. Fel's car came through the gates at 7:56. Cassian watched it arrive from the second-floor window of his study. The vehicle was a black sedan, appropriately understated for a man who understood that ostentation was a weakness, and it came alone, as promised. One driver, no visible security, which meant the security was invisible, and the fact that Fel had brought invisible security to a dinner he'd promised to attend alone told Cassian everything he needed to know about how Fel was reading the invitation. He was afraid. Good. The dining room at Moretti Estate was the formal one, not the smaller family room his mother preferred for private meals, but the long table room with the high ceiling and the portraits along the west wall and the chandelier that had been in the family for 3 generations. Isabella had overseen the setup herself, which meant it was immaculate and also sent a specific message. This is a formal occasion, which means rules apply, which means whatever happens here happens on record. Cassian was already in the room when Fel was brought in. He was standing at the far end of the table. Not sitting, not positioned with his back to the door, standing where the room's architecture put him in the dominant position without him having to manufacture it. He watched Dorian Fel walk the length of the dining room toward him and took inventory. Fel was 64 years old and carried it well, not through vanity, but through the physical discipline of a man who understood that deterioration was leverage other people would use against you. Silver hair, precisely cut, dark suit, a face that had spent 6 decades becoming unreadable and had largely succeeded. He walked with the measured pace of someone who never arrived anywhere faster than they intended to. He extended his hand when he reached Cassian. Cassian shook it. The grip was firm, held a beat longer than necessary. The old territorial language, 2 men in a room testing the architecture of power between them through the medium of a handshake. Cassian, Fel said, you're looking well. Sit down, Dorian. They sat. Cassian at the head, Fel to his immediate right, which was the position of the most significant guest, and also the position from which a man could not easily leave without making his departure visible. Isabella entered from the side door and took her place across from Fel, which completed the geometry. Cassian at the head, his mother on one side, Fel trapped between them and the wall. Fel registered it, said nothing. The first course arrived. They ate in the particular careful silence of people who are waiting for the real conversation to locate its beginning. It found it when Fel set down his fork after the second course and looked at Cassian and said, I was pleased to receive your invitation. It's been too long since we've talked directly. Has it? Cassian said. You've been occupied since your return. International matters, the council meetings. A pause. Personnel changes. There it was. Cassian picked up his wine glass, held it, did not drink. The personnel changes have been straightforward. Of course. Fell's tone was perfectly calibrated. Not aggressive, not retreating, occupying the precise middle space of a man who was probing for information while maintaining absolute deniability. I only mention it because the council has noted the changes. The reassignment of a member of household staff to a direct personal management role is unusual. The council notes my household staffing decisions. The council notes anything that represents a departure from pattern. Fell met his eyes. You've been remarkably consistent for 8 years, Cassian. Any change draws attention. Then the council can attend to its actual responsibilities and let me manage my household. A pause. Isabella was cutting her food with precise, unhurried movements and not looking at either of them, which meant she was listening to every syllable. Of course, Fell said. He picked up his fork again, set it down again. I did want to ask, how is the young woman settling into the new role? Miss Bennet, I believe. The name in Fell's mouth in this room landed with the weight of a deliberate provocation. Cassian looked at him. She's settling well. Good. I understand she came from a modest background, domestic service since she was quite young. A pause. Kelmore, wasn't it? The air in the room tightened by several degrees. Cassian set his wine glass down. He placed it with the same precise, controlled care he'd used to place the folder on the table in front of Greta, and the movement communicated the same thing. I know exactly what I'm doing, and I have decided to do it. Kelmore, he confirmed. Her mother still lives there. Fell looked at him. For the first time, something moved behind the composed face, a calculation happening faster than he could fully conceal it. A devoted family, Fell said carefully. Very. Cassian held his gaze. Her mother is well, in good health, currently under excellent care. He let that sit for one beat. 2. I take a personal interest in her welfare. The message was received. He could see it arrive. The slight adjustment in Fell's posture, the fractional recalibration of the eyes, the almost imperceptible understanding that the vulnerability he'd identified and documented and prepared to use had been seen and covered before he'd moved. Fell had been operating on the assumption that the file was unknown. That assumption was now destroyed. Isabella set down her fork and said, in the pleasant, conversational tone she used to devastating effect, Dorian, I've been meaning to ask, how is your relationship with the Eastern families developing? I've heard you've been quite active in that direction. Fell looked at her. The Eastern families are valuable partners for the syndicate. Of course they are. They've been valuable partners for 30 years. She smiled. I only ask because Cassian mentioned you've been particularly engaged with them recently, since before his return, in fact. A pause. It's good to see you investing in those relationships. Fell was looking at Isabella the way men looked at things that were more dangerous than they'd expected. He recovered quickly. He was good, genuinely good, and Cassian registered that without any sentiment attached to it, and said, the syndicate's strength has always come from maintaining its relationships. Indeed, Isabella lifted her wine. To relationships. They drank. The dinner ended at 10. Fell stood to leave and Cassian walked him to the door personally, which was a courtesy that also ensured they were briefly alone in the entrance hall, while Isabella remained in the dining room with the fiction of reviewing something with a staff member. They stood in the hall. The front door was 6 feet away. Fell's driver would be at the car. The invisible security was somewhere in the grounds, useless in this moment, because this moment was 2 men in a lit hallway with no weapons and no witnesses. Fell said quietly, You've been busy. I'm always busy. You know what I mean. I do. Cassian looked at him directly. No pretense left, no diplomatic surface. Just the conversation they'd actually been having all evening, finally stripped of its cover. I know about Shawl, I know about Rourke, I know about the file. He kept his voice level and his eyes steady. I know how long you've been running Greta and what she gave you. Fell was very still. You built a picture of me, Cassian said. 7 years of it. You knew my weaknesses, my patterns, every place I could be reached. And then you found a new one, and you put her name in a document. He paused. I want you to understand something, Dorian. Not as a threat, as information. Whatever you have planned, whatever use you've identified for that file, the moment you move against her or anyone connected to her, I will burn everything you've built to the ground. Not the syndicate, not the business, yours. Specifically, Entirely, personally, yours. He held Fell's eyes. I've been very careful for 8 years not to be the kind of man who operates like that. You should think carefully about whether you want to be the reason I stop being careful. The entrance hall was completely silent. Fell looked at him for a long moment with the unreadable face and the 6 decades of calculation running behind it. Then he said, You've changed. Yes. She did that. Yes. Something moved in Fell's expression that Cassian hadn't expected. Not fear exactly, and not respect exactly, but something in the territory between them. A reassessment. The look of a man who had built a model of someone and had just understood that the model was wrong. You're not going to let this go, Fell said. No. A pause. The council will have questions. The council can have whatever questions they like. I'll answer them in a full session in front of everyone, including whatever you've told the Eastern families about my vulnerabilities. He held Fell's gaze. I'd encourage you to think about what that session looks like and whether you want to be in the room for it. Fell was quiet for a moment that stretched. Then he said, You learned something from your father after all. I learned everything from my father, Cassian said, including which of his advisors to watch. Fell left. Cassian stood in the entrance hall and listened to the car move down the gravel drive and through the gates, and the sound of it faded into the winter night, and he stood in the silence after it for a long moment before he went to find Alara Sapp. She was in the household office, still awake, sitting with a cup of coffee gone cold and a book open in her lap that she wasn't reading. She looked up when he came in and read his face with the quickness she'd developed over these weeks. The ability to distinguish between his types of stillness, this one she'd seen before, after the council meetings and the late operational nights, the particular quality of controlled exhaustion that came after a hard thing done well. How did it go? She said. He sat down. Not across from her this time, but in the other chair beside hers, close enough that their proximity was a choice rather than a coincidence. He knows I know, he said. He also knows the file doesn't work anymore. He looked at the wall. Whether he accepts that or decides to push harder, I'll know in the next 48 hours by what he does. What does pushing harder look like? He calls a formal council session, tries to turn the Eastern families against me publicly, use the Greta information to argue I'm compromised. He paused. Or he moves directly against you or your mother before my security is fully in place, to demonstrate that my protection has limits. She absorbed this. And if he does the second thing, then it becomes a different kind of problem. She was quiet. He was looking at the wall and she was looking at her hands, and the office was very still around them, the cold pressing at the windows, the estate settling into itself in the deep winter night. I'm scared, she said. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without performance, just the fact of it placed on the table between them. Not for me, for my mother. She doesn't know any of this exists, and she's sitting in Kelmore, and she's covered. He turned to look at her. Vasek's team confirmed positions at 6 o'clock. She doesn't know they're there. She's safe. Alara nodded. He could see the effort behind the nod, the decision to believe him, to extend the trust into a situation her entire previous life had given her no practice for. She had grown up in Kelmore with a laundress mother and a freight driver father and 5 years of domestic service, and she was sitting in the private household of a syndicate head while a man with a targeting package assessed whether to use her mother's address against her. The distance between those two worlds was enormous, and she was navigating it without a map, and she hadn't broken yet. He reached across and took her hand. Not dramatically, just picked it up off her knee and held it, and her fingers closed around his with a firmness that said she'd been waiting for something to hold on to. They sat like that in the quiet office. If the council session happens, she said eventually, what do you need? He looked at her. You. Specifically. I need you in the room. He watched her face. Bell's strategy depends on the idea that you're a vulnerability, something to be ashamed of, hidden, managed. If you're in the room, visible, undisguised, speaking for yourself, the strategy falls apart. He paused. But it means standing in front of every significant power in the syndicate and being looked at and judged and not flinching. She was quiet for a moment. I've been looked at and judged my whole life, she said, by Greta. By every head housekeeper in every house I worked in, by people who hired me to be invisible and then resented me when I wasn't. She met his eyes. I know how to stand in a room full of people who don't think I belong there. This is different. I know it's different. Her hand tightened around his. I'm still not leaving. He held her gaze. In it, he saw the same thing he'd seen in the garden when she'd told him he didn't get to make the hard choice for her. The specific, unmovable quality of a person who has decided, and whose decision is not a performance, and not a negotiation, and not a response to external pressure, but just the thing they are. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth against her knuckles, brief and deliberate, and she went very still for a moment, the way she'd gone still, the first morning after the Vass. Not with fear this time, with something that had no clean name in any language but was the opposite of fear. Get some sleep, he said. Tomorrow I'll know which direction this goes. She nodded and stood and walked to the door, and at the door she stopped. Cassian. He looked up. For what it's worth. She was in the doorway, the corridor light behind her, her gray eyes very clear. I would choose this again, knowing everything. I would still choose it. She left. He sat alone in the office for a long time after, not working, not moving, just sitting with the weight of everything that had been set in motion. Fell in his city estate recalculating, Vasek's people on the perimeter, Greta in supervised quarters, the eastern families waiting to see which direction the wind moved, and somewhere in Kelmore, a woman who didn't know she was being protected sleeping in a house her daughter was determined to make safe. His phone rang at 2 a.m. Vasek. Fell called an emergency council session, Vasek said. Tomorrow night. He's already contacted the eastern representatives and 3 of the western lieutenants. A pause. He's moving faster than I expected. Cassian stood up. The exhaustion in his body was real. The specific weight of a man who hadn't slept enough in 8 years and had just spent an evening conducting the most important diplomatic operation of his life through the medium of a formal dinner. It sat in his shoulders and his eyes and the back of his skull like sediment. He breathed through it. What time? He said. 7 o'clock. His estate. His estate. Cassian absorbed that. Fell calling the session at his own estate rather than the neutral syndicate conference facility was a move. It communicated that he considered himself on strong enough ground to host, which meant he had numbers, which meant his 48 hours had been running longer than Cassian had accounted for. How many? Cassian said. 11 confirmed, possibly 14. The full council was 17. 11 was enough for a formal motion. 14 was enough to force a leadership review. Who's not confirmed? Vasek listed 6 names. Cassian sorted them mentally. 2 were genuinely neutral. 2 owed him direct personal loyalty. 2 were unpredictable. He did the arithmetic with the clarity of a man running on adrenaline and the compressed total focus that came to him in genuine crises. The same focus that had carried him through 8 years of running an organization while his interior life tried to come apart. I need to make 4 calls, he said. Get me clean lines. Standing by. And Vasek. He paused. Wake Alara. Tell her to meet me in my study in 20 minutes. A brief pause. Yes, sir. He ended the call and stood in the empty office and looked at the window, at the winter night beyond it, at the darkness over the grounds where his father's estate rose around him on all sides, and he thought with total clarity, this is the moment. Everything before was approach. This is the thing itself. He had 6 hours to build something that could survive a room full of men who had decided he was vulnerable, and the only way to build it was to stop pretending that the thing they'd identified as his weakness was actually a weakness at all. He picked up his phone and made the first call. In the corridor outside, he could hear, faintly, distantly, the sound of Ilara's door opening and her footsteps moving toward him through the cold dark of the house, and the sound of them was the most grounding thing he had. She arrived at his study at 2:23 in the morning with her hair pulled back and her face composed, and a sharpness in her eyes that told him she'd understood from the tone of Vasek's knock that this wasn't a conversation that could wait until daylight. He told her everything, not a summary. The full shape of it, the council session, Fell's estate, the numbers, the timeline, what a leadership review meant in practical terms for the syndicate and for the people inside it and for her specifically. He told her in the same direct sequential way he'd been telling her hard things since the garden, because she'd asked him to stop protecting her through ignorance, and he'd agreed to that, and he was going to hold to it even now, especially now. She listened standing up. She'd taken the chair earlier in their conversations. Tonight she stood, which he understood. Some information you received better on your feet, with your weight under you. When he finished, she said, What do you need me to do tonight? Sit with me while I make the calls. He stopped. I need someone in the room who isn't calculating. She sat. Yim had 4 calls in the next 90 minutes. The first 2 were to the lieutenants who owed him direct loyalty, Marin and Sokolov. And those conversations were brief and operational. Yes, they knew about the session. Yes, they'd be there. Yes, they understood what was at stake. The third call was to an older council member named Hess, 70 years old and genuinely neutral, who had known Cassian's father and who picked up on the third ring without surprise, as though he'd been awake and expecting the call. You know about tomorrow, Cassian said. I know about tonight, Hess said. It's past 2, Cassian. I need to know where you stand. A long pause. I stand where I've always stood, with the organization's stability. Another pause. Fell has been talking to people for 3 weeks. He's built a case that you're compromised by a personal attachment that represents a security vulnerability. And what do you think? I think a man who finally has something to lose is harder to break than a man who's given up on caring. Hess was quiet for a moment. I'll be in the room. I haven't decided how I'll vote on a review motion, if one comes to that, but I'll be in the room. That's all I'm asking. He ended the call and looked at the 4th name on his list and put the phone down. Who's the 4th one? Ilara said. Fell himself. She was quiet. Not to negotiate, he said. I'm not calling to negotiate. I'm calling to tell him directly that I know his timeline and his numbers, and that I'm coming to that session, and that if he wants to put this in front of the full council, I will answer every question they have. He picked up the phone. In front of everyone. About all of it. She looked at him. Including me. Including you. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once, and he dialed. Fell answered on the 2nd ring, which meant he'd been awake too. Cassian, he said. 7 o'clock, Cassian said. I'll be there. A pause. Bring everyone you've committed. I want the full council in that room. Silence on the other end. Then, you're certain. I'm certain. Another silence, longer. All right, Fell said, and something in his voice, beneath the 64 years of composure, beneath the calculation and the patience and the political fluency, was a note that Cassian identified after a moment as the sound a man made when a plan he'd built carefully suddenly became uncertain in ways he hadn't modeled. Cassian ended the call. Ilara was looking at him from her chair with her hands in her lap, and the winter dark pressing at the windows around them. Try to sleep, he said. A few hours. Will you? He looked at his desk, at the operational maps and the council roster and the list of names with their alignments marked in Vasek's handwriting. No. She stood up and came to where he was sitting and did something she hadn't done before. She put her hand on the back of his neck, brief and deliberate, the way you'd steady something you didn't want to see fall. Then she went to the door. Cassian. She didn't turn around. Whatever happens in that room, you walked into it. You didn't run. A pause. That matters. She left. He sat alone in the study until the winter dark began to go gray at its edges, and he worked, and he did not sleep, and he was ready. Fell's estate was 40 minutes from Aldenvale, a property that was slightly newer and significantly more ostentatious than the Moretti grounds, the kind of house that communicated wealth rather than history. Cassian arrived at 6:58 in a car with Vasek and 2 security personnel, all of them in dark suits, none of them visibly armed in ways that would read as provocation. Ilara was in the 2nd car with 2 of Vasek's best people, and Isabella, who had insisted on attending with the specific, immovable quality she brought to decisions she'd already made and wasn't going to discuss further. This is my family's business, she'd said at 5 in the morning over coffee in the kitchen, the first time Cassian had seen her drink coffee in 30 years of living in the same house. Fell has been operating in this organization since before you were born. If he wants a council session, he can have the full Moretti family present for it. Cassian had not argued. The council room at Fell's estate was large and deliberately impressive. A long table, high-backed chairs, portraits of no one in particular on the walls providing the aesthetic of institutional weight. 12 council members were already seated when Cassian walked in. Fell was at the far end of the table in the chair that positioned him as the session's convener. He had not taken the head of the table. That position was empty. Cassian walked to it and sat down. The room was very quiet. He looked at each face around the table. Marin and Sokolov, with their careful neutrality, Hess with his 70-year-old stillness, the Eastern representatives with their collective wariness, the Western lieutenants who had been Fell's conversations for 3 weeks, and who now sat looking at Cassian with the particular expression of men who had committed to a direction and were reassessing their confidence in it. He looked at Fell, who was looking back at him with the composed face and the eyes that were doing something faster underneath. Isabella came in last and took the seat to Cassian's left without looking at Fell. Alara did not come into the room. That was deliberate, and it was Cassian's decision, and she'd agreed to it without argument. She would be in the building, she would be present, but the council room was the space for the people whose power was at stake. Her entrance would come when it would mean the most. "Let's begin," Cassian said. Fell spoke for 20 minutes. "How was good?" Cassian had always known Fell was good. 7 years of watching him operate had established that clearly. And in the council session, he was precise and organized and built his case with the architecture of someone who had been preparing it for longer than 3 weeks. He had documentation. He had Greta's testimony, prepared in writing, concerning the pattern of Cassian's behavior since his return. He had the targeting package analysis framed as a security brief, not Fell's own file on Alara, but a version of the concern dressed in the language of organizational protection. The case he made was this: that Cassian Moretti had formed a personal attachment that represented a critical security vulnerability, that this attachment had already resulted in a compromise of estate intelligence, and that a leadership review was warranted to assess whether the current head of the Blackthorn Syndicate was capable of the objective judgment the position required. He didn't name Alara directly in the formal presentation. He called her the individual in question. It was a calculated choice, formal enough to maintain procedure, dehumanizing enough to keep the room in the register of organizational concern rather than personal attack. When Fell finished, the room was quiet. Cassian let the quiet sit for a moment. Then he said, "Are you finished?" Fell looked at him. "I've presented the council's concerns." "Your concerns." Cassian looked around the table. "Does anyone here want to add something before I respond?" No one spoke. "Good." He placed his hands flat on the table, both hands, visible, a deliberate gesture of openness rather than concealment. "I'm going to answer the concern as stated, and then I'm going to tell you what actually happened, and then I'm going to ask you to make a decision based on the complete picture rather than the partial one." He spoke for 35 minutes. He told them about the panic attacks. He had never told anyone in this room, and the telling of it cost him something real. He felt it in his chest as he said the words. The specific exposure of putting the interior thing into the air of a room full of people with power. He said it plainly, without apology. Since the night his father died, he had been managing a trauma response that had been untreated and unacknowledged for 8 years, and it had been affecting his capacity in ways that everyone in the room had noticed, and none of them had been able to name. He said this, and he watched the faces around the table shift, not with contempt, as he'd feared for 8 years, but with something more complicated. Recognition in some of them. Discomfort in others. In Hess, something that looked very close to grief. He told them about Greta. All of it. Not the version that protected her from full exposure, but the accurate version. That she had been running as an information source for Fell for 7 years. That the intelligence she'd provided had been used to build a targeting package on a civilian with no connection to the syndicate, for use as leverage. That the security vulnerability wasn't his attachment to Alara, it was the fact that someone inside his household had been feeding his most significant internal rival for nearly a decade, and that rival had been using it not to protect the syndicate, but to position himself to take it. He placed copies of Vasek's documentation on the table, the phone records, the surveillance photographs, the chain from Greta to Shawl to Rourke to Fell's inner circle. He watched Fell's face as the copies moved around the table. The composure held, but it held the way a structure holds when the load it was built for has been exceeded, technically intact, visibly strained. "The security concern Mr. Fell has raised," Cassian said, "is real. Personal attachments do create vulnerabilities. He's correct about that." He looked at Fell directly. "What he hasn't mentioned is that he spent 7 years exploiting a different personal attachment, a loyal employee's grief and her devotion to a dead man's wishes, to build a surveillance operation inside this organization directed at its own head." He paused. "That's the vulnerability the council should be examining." The room was very still. Hess said quietly, "Dorian." Fell said nothing. "I want to ask something," Cassian said. He addressed the room now, not Fell specifically. "The concern has been raised that I am compromised, that I have developed a connection to someone outside this organization that makes my judgment unreliable. He looked at each face. I want you to consider an alternative interpretation, that for 8 years I ran this organization on nothing but damage. No sleep, no stability, no interior life of any kind. I was reliable because I had nothing to lose, and men with nothing to lose make decisions that prioritize the organization over everything, including whether the organization's decisions are actually correct. A pause. Is that what you want in a leader? Someone who operates that way because the alternative terrifies them? No one answered. They were all listening. Or do you want someone who has something to protect and is therefore, for the first time in 8 years, actually thinking clearly about what's worth protecting and what isn't? He let that settle. I'm not asking you to approve of my personal life. I'm asking you to think carefully about what you're actually voting on if a review motion comes to the table. He sat back. The silence that followed was the longest in the room. Then Hess said, I won't be supporting a review motion. He said it to the table, not to Fell, and the saying of it had the quality of a door closing. I've known this family for 40 years. I knew Aldo Moretti when he was younger than Cassian is now, and I watched him build this organization from a regional operation into what it is. And I never once saw him make a decision out of fear of his own humanity. He looked up. His son is doing the same thing. I'm done pretending I don't see it. The Eastern representative on Cassian's right said, after a moment, we didn't come here to vote against the Moretti family. We came here because we were told there was a stability concern. He looked at Fell. The documentation Mr. Moretti has provided suggests the stability concern originates somewhere other than where we were told. Fell said, the documentation is Vasek's work, Cassian said. If you'd like to dispute it to him directly. He's in the building. Fell was quiet. One by one, the men around the table withdrew their support for the review motion. Not dramatically, not with speeches, but in the practical language of people who had recalculated and arrived somewhere different than where they'd started. It took 20 minutes. At the end of it, Fell sat at his end of the table, with nothing left in the room that had been built for him. Cassian looked at him. Dorian. Fell met his eyes. You're going to step back from the council, Cassian said. Not a request, not a threat, a fact stated in advance of its occurrence. You'll retain your business interests. The operational separation will be clean and fair, and I'll have the paperwork drafted by the end of the week. He paused. What you will not have, going forward, is a role in this organization's governance. That ended tonight. Fell looked at him for a long moment. Your father, Fell said, would have handled this differently. My father trusted you, Cassian said. I'm handling it exactly the way he would have if he'd known what I know. Fell stood. He straightened his jacket with the precise, unhurried movements of a man who understood that the only dignity left available to him was in the quality of his exit. He looked at Isabella, who had not spoken a single word in the entire session, and whose silence had been the most eloquent thing in the room. She looked back at him without expression. He left. The room exhaled. Cassian found Alara in a small sitting room off the main corridor, standing at the window with her arms crossed and her back to the door, looking at the winter grounds of an estate that wasn't hers and wasn't his, and that they would leave within the hour. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She hadn't heard him come in. He said her name. She turned around, and the question in her face, the one she'd been sitting with for the 90 minutes the session had lasted, dissolved when she saw his expression. She breathed out. It's done. It's done. She uncrossed her arms, pressed them against her sides for a moment as though she needed to feel her own steadiness. Then she said, Fell? Removed from the council. He'll accept it. He doesn't have a better option. Greta? That's a harder question. He came into the room. She believed what she was doing. That doesn't make it not a betrayal. But it was a betrayal that came from grief and manipulation rather than malice. He looked at the window, at the winter light on the grounds. My mother will decide. It should be her decision. Alara nodded. Your mother was extraordinary in that room. She said nothing. I know. A pause. That was the extraordinary part. He looked at her. She was still standing with her arms at her sides, a deliberate stillness, and in the winter light of the sitting room she looked exactly like what she was, a 24-year-old woman from Kelmore who had spent the last 6 weeks navigating a world she had no map for, and had not once allowed that fact to make her smaller. There's going to be a formal gathering, he said. The Moretti family hosts one every year. Business associates, allied families, political contacts. It's in 6 weeks. He held her eyes. I want you there. Not as staff, not as support, as the person you are to me. She looked at him carefully. That's a significant thing to say in front of that room. Yes. Some of those people tonight, some of those council members, will be at that gathering. Yes. They'll have opinions. They'll have opinions about everything for the rest of their lives. That's not going to change. He held her gaze. The question is whether I let their opinions make decisions that should be mine. She was quiet for a moment. And your mother? She's all right with this? She told me this morning that the best decision I'd made since returning to the estate was putting you in a position where I had to stop pretending I didn't. He stopped. He looked at the floor briefly, then back at her. That I had to stop pretending. Alara looked at him. I'm not good at this part, he said. The saying it clearly part. I've spent 8 years making sure I didn't feel things clearly enough to need to say them. He looked at her hands, at the strip of medical tape that was long gone, at the healed line across her palm that he'd watched bleed on his grandmother's floor on a morning he now thought of as the beginning of something rather than an incident to be managed. But I know what I want. I know what you are to me, and I'm done letting fear make that decision. She took a breath. Let it out slowly. I know what you are to me too, she said. I've known for a while. I just kept waiting for the thing that would make it impossible. She looked up at him. Every time something happened, I thought, this is it. This is the thing that ends it. The vase. The garden. Fell. The council session. She paused. And it kept not ending. It's not going to end, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said quietly, okay, just that. No drama in it, no performance. Just the word, placed between them like something she was done not saying. He crossed the distance between them, and she let him. And when he put his arms around her, she pressed her forehead against his shoulder with the exhaustion of someone who had been braced for impact for 6 weeks and had finally, carefully, decided they could stop. They stood in the sitting room of Fell's estate in the winter morning light, and outside the window the grounds were cold and still. And inside the house, the council members were leaving one by one, and somewhere in the city Fell was making the calls that would begin his organizational withdrawal. And somewhere in Kelmore, a woman who didn't know her daughter had been protected through the night was waking up to an ordinary morning that had remained ordinary because of decisions made in the dark. Cassian stood in the stillness of the moment and felt, for the first time in 8 years, the specific quality of a weightlifting. Not disappearing, because grief didn't disappear, and trauma didn't disappear, and the locked study door in the east wing would still be there when he got home. But lifting. Shifting. Becoming something he could carry, rather than something that carried him. They drove back to Aldenvale as the morning opened up. Isabella rode in silence for the first 20 minutes and then said, from the front seat, without turning around, Fell will be cooperative. He's too intelligent not to be, now that the math has changed. She paused. Hess will be a useful ally going forward. He's been neutral for years out of caution, not indifference. Tonight changed his calculus. I know, Cassian said. The Eastern representatives will need individual follow-up. Don't let them feel like they came to that room on the wrong side and walk away without acknowledgement. People remember how they were treated when they were wrong. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, still without turning, You did well tonight. He said nothing. Your father would have... She stopped, started again. Aldo would have been proud, not because you won, because you were honest about what cost you to win. A pause. He spent years pretending the cost of this life was 0. It was the only dishonesty I ever saw in him, and it came from love. He didn't want the people around him to carry the weight of knowing what the life actually required. She was quiet. You didn't do that tonight. You put it on the table. A long pause. That takes more courage than the other way. In the back seat, beside him, Alara was looking out the window at the passing winter landscape. She had one hand resting on the seat between them, and he placed his over it, not looking at her, just the fact of the contact, and she turned her palm up, and her fingers closed around his. Isabella said nothing more. The east wing door was the last thing. He'd known it would have to be the last thing, in the way you know the shape of necessary things before you're ready to do them. He'd walked past it twice since his return, once on the night of his arrival, Once in the slow aftermath of telling Alara about his father, and each time it had been an act of will not to stop. He stopped now. It was a Tuesday afternoon, 3 days after the council session, 2 weeks before the formal gathering that would mark the first time Alara stood beside him in front of the full scope of the world he inhabited. The estate was quiet, in the way it was quiet in the deep afternoon. The staff in their routines, the ground staff outside, Isabella in her sitting room with Holbert going through the winter accounts. He stood in front of the door with his key in his hand. Alara was beside him. She hadn't been invited. He hadn't planned to have anyone with him for this, but she'd seen him take the key from the hook in his study, and she'd simply fallen into step beside him without asking, and he hadn't told her not to come, and now she was here. He looked at the door. "You don't have to do this today," she said. "I've been saying that for 8 years. Then maybe today is the day you stop saying it." He put the key in the lock. The door opened on a room that smelled of old paper and the specific particular absence of air that spaces accumulated when they'd been closed for a long time. His father's desk was where it had always been. Large, dark wood, positioned to face the door and the window simultaneously. The configuration of a man who wanted to see what was coming. Books on the shelves, a photograph on the desk, face up, visible from the door. He walked in. He stood in the center of the room and breathed the air of it, stale and cold and carrying everything that had lived here before. He looked at the desk, the chair behind it, the window that looked out over the east grounds where Soldier, the dog with the stupid name, had spent 11 years of his life following a boy who hadn't known yet what he'd eventually have to carry. He picked up the photograph. His father at 50, maybe 51, the age he'd been in the years just before the night on the road. A formal photograph, something from a business occasion, but the expression in it was the one Cassian had seen at the dinner table and in the garden and in the car, in the moments before everything changed. Not the public face, the actual one. The eyes that had looked at him with the specific love of a parent who knew exactly what they were leaving their child and wished it were different and couldn't change it. He held the photograph and didn't say anything for a long time. Alara was in the doorway. She hadn't come all the way into the room. She was standing at the threshold, giving him the room itself while remaining present at its edge, which was exactly right, which was the thing she did that he had no adequate language for. He set the photograph back on the desk, facing up. "He would have liked you," he said. Not to her exactly. To the room, to the photograph, to the man who had asked Greta to protect his son and had not been able to anticipate how that protection would be used. He had no patience for people who pretended. He could always tell. He paused. "You never pretend." Alara said nothing. She let it exist. "I've been carrying him wrong," Cassian said. "I've been carrying him like a debt, like I owed the world a suffering that matched what I lost." He looked at the photograph. That's not what he would have wanted. He would have been furious about it, actually. A pause. Something that might have been the ghost of a smile. He had a terrible temper. "Runs in the family," Alara said quietly. He looked at her over his shoulder. "From what I can tell," she added. He turned back to the room. He looked at it fully. The desk, the books, the window, the photograph, the chair behind the desk that had a slight list to the left because his father had always sat with his weight shifted, a habit Cassian had never thought about until this moment, and now would never be able to forget. "I'm going to open this room," he said. "Use it. Not keep it as—" He paused. "Not as a monument." He wasn't a monument. He was a person. He looked at the desk. He had a terrible temper, and he fed a dog table scraps, and he trusted the wrong person out of loyalty, and he loved his son in ways he didn't always know how to say. A pause. "He deserves to be remembered as that, not as the reason I stopped living." The room was very quiet. He walked back to the door. He stood next to Alara in the threshold and looked back at the room one more time, at the photograph face up on the desk, at the window with the east grounds beyond it, at the chair with the slight list to the left. And then he pulled the door shut behind him. Not locked, just closed. He breathed. The gathering was on a Saturday in early spring, 3 weeks after the roses in the West Garden produced their first full blooms of the season. 200 people. Families, allies, politicians, business partners, the full scope of the world. The Blackthorn Syndicate inhabited and shaped and was shaped by. They came to the Moretti estate and moved through the lit rooms and the opened-up ground floor in the West Garden where lanterns had been strung between the trellises and they talked and assessed and watched. They watched Alara. She wore dark blue. Isabella had helped her choose it, and the choice had been strategic as well as aesthetic, the color of composed authority rather than aggressive display. She moved through the gathering with a quality of attention that was entirely her own. She listened when people spoke. She asked questions rather than deflecting. She did not perform anything. When a business associate of 30 years fixed her with the specific look of a man deciding whether to take her seriously, she held his gaze until he looked away first. And she did it without malice or effort, simply because she'd decided she was done being smaller than she was. Cassian watched her from across the room for most of the first hour. He moved through his own conversations, the necessary ones, the alliance maintenance ones, the follow-ups from the council session that needed to happen in person. And he did them with the half of his attention they required and kept the other half on her. Not with anxiety, with something that had no word for it in the syndicate's operational vocabulary, a warmth, a specifically located satisfaction, the feeling of watching something true become visible in a room full of people who had expected something else. When he finally crossed the room to her, it was late in the evening, and the gathering had found its rhythm, and the people who had come expecting to see a vulnerability had been watching long enough to understand that they'd misread the situation. He came to stand beside her. She glanced at him. "How are you doing?" he said quietly. "Costner just told me I reminded him of my own strength," she said. "I told him I'd been hearing that my whole life from people who were surprised by it." A pause. He laughed. "I think he decided he likes me. Costner hasn't liked anyone in 20 years. Then I've done something useful tonight." He looked at the room around them, the gathered weight of everything the Blackthorn Syndicate was, and had been, and would be going forward. And then he looked at her and he said, quietly enough that it was only for her, "I want to ask you something, later, when the room is empty." She looked at him. Read his face with the quickness she'd developed over months of learning him. Something moved in her eyes. Not surprise, exactly. The look of someone who had been watching something approach from a long distance and was now, finally, watching it arrive. "All right," she said. They stood together in the lit room with the winter giving way outside and the lanterns burning in the west garden and the gathered world of the Blackthorn Syndicate moving around them. And for a moment they were just two people standing in a room, not a syndicate head and his former housemaid, not a man with 8 years of damage and a woman with 5 years of invisibility, not the story that had been made about them by the people with agendas. Just two people who had found each other in a hallway over a broken vase and a cut hand and had decided, repeatedly and against considerable evidence that it was a reasonable idea, to keep choosing each other. The West Garden was empty at midnight. The lanterns were still lit. The roses that had come back after the frost, the survivors, the ones that had produced the first blooms of early spring, were in full color now, red and white and the deep pink that his mother called carmine, climbing the south trellis in the way they'd been climbing it since before Cassian was born. The stone bench was where it had always been. He was already there when she came through the gate. She sat beside him on the bench, not with the deliberate gap she'd left between them the first evening, months ago, but close. Their arms were touching. She was looking at the roses. He reached into his jacket pocket. She turned to look at him, and the lantern light caught her face, and 8 years of grief and isolation, and the locked study door, and the panic attacks in empty rooms. And the night his father's hand had released its grip on his were all present in this moment as the context rather than the weight. Not gone, not erasable, but transformed into the thing that had made this moment possible rather than the thing that prevented it. He said her name. He said it the way he'd said it the first time back in the corridor when she'd been walking away, and she went still the way she'd gone still then. He opened his hand. She looked at what was in it for a long moment. Then she looked at him. Alara. His voice was steady. It cost him to keep it steady, and he kept it steady anyway. "You came around a corner with your arms full and you didn't look away. You listened in a garden. You told me the truth about everything you saw, and you never dressed it up, and you never used it, and you never asked me for anything in exchange." He paused. "You gave me back the parts of myself I decided I was done needing." He held her gaze. "I don't know how to do this part gracefully. I'm better at managing crises than I am at this." "You're doing fine," she said, quiet, clear. "Will you marry me?" The garden held its breath. She looked at him for a moment that stretched, not with hesitation, but with the fullness of it, taking it in properly, because she was not the kind of person who received important things carelessly. Then she said, "Yes." He put the ring on her hand. She looked at it once, briefly, in the way she looked at everything important, registering it without making a production of it. And then she looked back at him. He took her face in his hands and kissed her, and the rose garden was quiet around them, and the lanterns burned, and somewhere in the estate his mother was still awake, as she always was, and knew without being told. Afterward, they sat on the bench in the same position they'd sat in months ago, close, arms touching, the gap long since closed. And he looked at the surviving roses, and she looked at the stars coming through the cleared winter sky. And neither of them said anything for a while, which was its own kind of language, the kind they'd been building between them since the beginning. "The vase," she said eventually. He looked at her. "I'll never entirely forgive myself for that vase." He looked at the garden, at the south trellis where she'd been pulling weeds on a cold afternoon when he'd first sat down beside her, at the lantern she'd told him would come on at dusk, at the stone bench with the moss at its base, and the garden that had held them through 8 years of locked doors, and finally, one ordinary evening in late autumn had been where something broke open that turned out to be the right thing to break. "It was the best accident that ever happened to me," he said. She made a small sound that was half a laugh and not entirely. He reached over and took her hand, the one with the healed line across the palm, the one that had bled on his grandmother's floor and changed something irrevocably in the direction of his life, and held it, and she held his back, and the lanterns burned in the garden that had outlasted a frost, and above them the stars were very clear. The darkness that had owned him for 8 years was not gone. It would return in smaller and smaller forms, and there would be night still, and locked doors still to open, and a world that did not become safe simply because one extraordinary Thursday evening it became more navigable. He knew all of that. He also knew this. The guilt was not the truth of what his father had left him. The grief was not the whole of what remained. The man in the photograph on the desk in the East Wing study, the man with the terrible temper and the dog he pretended to find annoying, had left him something else too. Something that had survived 8 years of being buried under damage and fear and the decision to stop needing things. He had left him the capacity for this, for the bench, the garden. The woman beside him who had walked around a corner with her arms full and looked straight at him and hadn't looked away. The Moretti estate rose around them on all sides, old stone and winter roses, and a history that was still being made, and Cassian sat in the quiet of it with Ilara's hand in his, and let himself, for the first time in as long as he could remember, simply be here, present, unguarded, alive.